and evil. What's interesting historically, when you look at the early Muslim conquests, as people like to call them, I mean, even in prayer, when we start our prayer, that's called a conquest. So Muslims are not looking at the conquest in the sense of only a military victory. But when they entered those countries, people greeted them and welcomed them. They did not rise up against them. In fact, some of them even sent letters to the Muslim leader saying, come invade the country, we'll help you and help us to relieve this yoke of oppression from our necks. So it's very rare to find that there was a wide resistance against the occupying armies of the Muslims.
During the 7th and the 8th century, when Muslims fought against the Roman Byzantines and the Persians, they were rarely faced by any civil resistance. In fact, many civilians joined the Muslim armies and fought against the Romans and the Persians themselves.
John, the Bishop of Nikiyu, an Egyptian Coptic historian, was an eyewitness to the Muslim army's conquest of Egypt. He wrote in his chronicles that the Egyptian Aryans joined the Muslims in besieging the Roman soldiers in the Babylon fortress. The emerging Muslim community under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad was surrounded by two of the greatest civilizations known in the history of mankind, the Roman Byzantines and the Persians. Despite histories of achievement in the service of humanity, civilian populations were ravaged by war and suffered mass genocide at their hands.
Innocent civilians were raped and killed. Cities were looted, plundered, and put ablaze in wars at that time at the hands of the Romans and the Persians, like in Salamis, Carthage, Rhodes, and Sardis, and in many other places.
Islam did not allow combat except after putting regulations on it. There is a code of combat in Islam.
Prophet Muhammad taught his followers to observe a strict code of war. He strongly emphasized the protection of civilians and their property, as well as aiding them through the difficult times after conflict.
When we talk about the Prophet's teaching in its relationship to jihad, there are two important points that we need to make. One, we've already made: when it is allowable for a Muslim to fight, and that was clarified earlier. But secondly, this is not like some type of WWF anarchist approach towards fighting. The Prophet, peace be upon him, as well as the Quran, laid out very specific examples and rules for the one who's engaged in combat. Because combat is one of the most hated words in Islam. In fact, people would come to the Prophet and say that they named their son War, and the Prophet would say, change your son's name. Combat is not something that's liked by people. So definitely it has to come with rules, because the ability for people to oppress and harm others is great in combat. So number one, the Prophet forbade us very clearly not to kill people from other faiths, religious leaders of other faiths. Number one, to harm the older, elderly people, to harm those people who are unarmed, to harm children, to harm any innocent civilian is clearly forbidden in Islam. In fact, some of the prophetic narrations about killing the innocent and warning against doing so have reached the status of what's called tawatur, which means so many people narrated those statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that there's no room for doubt, there's no room for questioning them, and the Muslim is bound to act on them, or he goes outside of what's called war and becomes known as what's known as a terrorist.
The controversy over what to count as legitimate act of war or a good act of jihad versus what must be considered a vicious act of terrorism has created an atmosphere of confusion which some have used to their advantage.
There seemed to be a great mix-up between martyrdom in a sense of self-sacrifice, something which is regarded as a noble act by all armies all over the world, people who sacrifice their life and are praised as heroes or freedom fighters on one hand, even if that requires self-sacrifice, and between acts of terror with people who are misled to believe that this is martyrdom. In other words, there are acts that are Islamically acceptable as true martyrdom that are called terrorist activities. And there are also acts that are basically terroristic acts and violate the teachings of Islam that some people call it jihad or martyrdom. That confusion must be removed.
The rules of international law on methods and means of warfare, it's known as international humanitarian law. It places very strict limits. You distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Combatants are a legitimate target, non-combatants are not a legitimate target. And those rules are now codified in a set of instruments that were negotiated and concluded in 1949, the Geneva Conventions. And there are 4 Geneva Conventions supplemented by 2 protocols in 1977. And the rules in Geneva, to a very large extent, reflect what's called customary international law. That's to say they are binding on everyone, on all states, on all actors, on non-governmental entities as well.
Among the teachings of Islam is that no one can be fought except a combatant. And this is one of the main rulings of the Code of Combat in Islam, which is stated clearly in various verses of the Quran and the statements made by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
The Quran says, "And fight in the cause of God those who fight against you, but begin not hostilities. Indeed, God does not love those who commit aggression."
By saying fight those who fight you, the verse is clearly putting a limitation on fighting to be directed only against combatants who took arms against Muslims and started hostilities.
Violating the Islamic ethical code of combat, such as targeting non-combatants or fighting an unjust war, disqualifies it as jihad.
Killing civilians on 9/11 cannot be justified in Islam. What happened on 7/7 cannot be justified in Islam. Bombing civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki can also not be justified in Islam.
Innocent civilians are innocent civilians. We don't have something called collateral damage in Islam. Collateral damage could show up on the day of judgment and speak against you. A child, an innocent woman, an innocent man, or an old person. So we have to really clarify this point for people and have to actively address Muslims who carry those ideas too, that the killing of innocents, the killing of innocent civilians is an issue of violating a treaty, which is a form of hypocrisy and lying, which are from some of the major sins in Islam. So by killing an innocent person, not only are you bringing upon yourself the major sin of murder, you're bringing on yourself the major sin of hypocrisy as well as forgery and lying.
Even though the Islamic rulings are clear as to the prohibition of targeting non-combatants, some Muslim fanatics who fail to comprehend the rulings of jihad have been involved in terrorism. Less than 2 decades after the death of Prophet Muhammad, fanaticism appeared amongst a group of Muslims known as the Khawarij, or Kharijites.
Shortly after the death of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a group called the Khawarij surfaced, and their primary function was destruction, killing, and chaos, disregarding the Quranic injunction that ordered people to respect the sanctity of the soul.
Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, foretold the appearance of fanaticism amongst some Muslims. He spoke about their characteristics.
Prophet Muhammad explained that the problem was not that their intentions were corrupt, but rather it was their understanding of the religion that was not sound. He said, "Each of you would consider his own prayers and fasting insignificant compared to their prayers and fasting. They would recite the Quran, but it would not go any deeper than their throats. They would leave the religion just as the arrow exits from the other side of the prey."
Sins in Islam are of 2 types, major sins and minor sins. Killing is among the major sins. It's a major sin to kill in Islam to the extent that killing one innocent soul is equal to the killing of all mankind.
The Quran says, whoever kills a person except in punishment for the killing of another person or for the spreading of dire corruption in the earth, it shall be reckoned as though he has killed all humankind. And whoever saves a life, it shall be reckoned as though he has saved the life of all humankind. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, alluded to the graveness of the crime of murder when he said, "A faithful believer remains at liberty regarding his religion unless he kills somebody unlawfully."
Because of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings that murder is a major sin and a vicious and evil crime, violent ideologies like that of Al-Khawarij never found a good medium to propagate in the Muslim world, except in the past few decades. This is a phenomenon worthy of studying.
The ideology of the Khawarij reemerged during the past few decades. Similarly, the contemporary extremists incorrectly interpret Quranic texts to justifying the killing of civilians.
The birth of the Khawarij really provides an archetype for Muslims to constantly compare those groups who claim or take a stake in authenticity. And when we look at the Khawarij, we see a few common traits. Number one is hyperliteralism. There is no concept of analogy, no concern for context of text. The verse is what it is. The meanings of the words are as they are, and there's no deep investigation into the reasons and objectives behind religious text. Number two is a fetish for standing up against religious scholarship, discrediting the role of scholars, the guidance of scholars. Number three is looking at society in general, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, in a very, very negative way, in apocalyptic fashion. And interesting enough, many of these traits are shared amongst groups like Qaeda, as well as some of the more fringe neoconservative groups in North America, who, for example, have called for the death of our President Obama. Some of them are supplicating in churches, asking for his demise. These type of traits, Muslims look at them and are reminded of that devastating historical epic that we encountered when we dealt with the Khawarij.
Fadl Soliman, a Muslim who has dedicated his life to educating non-Muslims on Islam and to de-radicalizing Muslim youth who may have fallen under the influence of self-appointed leaders, challenged their ideology.
We have our own law, the law of God, who says in his book, وَإِنْ آقَبْتُمْ فَآقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا أُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. And if you punish, let your punishment be proportionate to the wrong that has been done to you.
In fact, they debated with me, saying, according to this verse in the Quran, we are allowed to kill their innocents and their civilians, as they killed our innocents and our civilians in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Kashmir. So I said, but they did not only kill our civilians, they also raped our women in Bosnia. If you think that the verse is actually allowing you to respond to them in the same way you were harmed, why don't you go and rape their women? They said, no, we don't do that. I said, why not? Don't you think that the verse is allowing you to do this? They said, no, rape is an illegal sexual act. I said, therefore, the verse is not general. This verse is equal to the one in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which also exists in the Quran, which means that simply if someone blew up one eye for you, you cannot blow up both his eyes. If someone damaged one tooth for you, you cannot go and damage all his 32 teeth. One eye and one tooth do not transgress your limits. But still, you cannot rape women, even if your enemy did. You cannot kill non-combatant civilians, even if your enemy did, or you would be exactly like them.
The Old Testament says, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. The Quran says, now, in it we prescribe for them a life for a life, and an eye for an eye, and a nose for a nose, and an ear for an ear, and a tooth for a tooth, and retribution for wounds. Yet whoever would forego this, out of charity, then it will be taken as an atonement for the one who has suffered injury. In the last few years, incidents involving the abuse, torture, and dehumanizing of prisoners of war, exposed by leaked pictures and eyewitness accounts, have caused outrage around the world. Some guilty officers and wardens were trialed and sentenced to jail, whilst the real criminals have not been brought to justice.
And Common Article 3 basically says that when you have a detainee, irrespective of who they are, irrespective of whether they're a prisoner of war, a combatant or non-combatant, you have to treat them with humanity. You cannot impose outrages against their dignity. You cannot abuse them. You cannot be cruel to them. You cannot torture them. And that is a bottom line rule that applies at all times and in all circumstances and reflects general international law. And that is well established in what you've called the Code of Combatants in international law. It's often not respected, but it provides a benchmark against which one decides whether or not an act or a form of treatment is legitimate and lawful or not.
The central thing, I think, to focus on if we want to limit these kind of violations is not tighter and tighter rules by international lawyers to circumscribe states. We've got to cut directly to the reason why states are doing it. They're doing it because they believe they'll get an advantage. Do they actually get an advantage? I'm thinking of studying torture. I don't believe torture provides much of any real advantage. So what's the case for torture?
Many practices that are contrary to human rights are being increasingly justified as means to obtain important intelligence and to fight the war on terror in general. Unsurprisingly, this has resulted in much international and domestic debate over the effectiveness of these methods. The Islamic perspective on this matter, however, is crystal clear.
Muslims are not allowed to torture or dehumanize prisoners of war, irrespective of how they are designated.
It is rule number 2 in the Islamic Code of Combat. Prisoners of war are not to be killed or tortured. This rule is solidly established, and it was clearly observed during numerous incidents during the Prophet's time.
After the Muslims were forced to immigrate from Mecca to Medina, an armed conflict began between the Muslims and the tribe of Quraysh, which lasted more than 8 years. Known as the Battle of Badr, this was the first in a field of battles that took place between the Muslims and their enemies. In the year 624 AD, a small, poorly prepared army of 317 Muslims met a heavily supplied army of 1,000 Meccan idolaters. The night before the battle took place, an intelligent unit of 3 companions of the Prophet arrested 2 men who were bringing water from the army of Quraysh. The Prophet's wisdom shone in his chosen method to extract information from them. It is a clear display of the high standard of morality to be implemented when dealing with prisoners of war.
During one of the battles, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, criticized his companions for beating 2 prisoners of war in an attempt to obtain some information. This was an immoral act, and in torturing the prisoners, the information was also unreliable.
The Prophet, peace be upon him, had a different approach to the situation. He simply asked the 2 prisoners, "How many camels do you slaughter every day?" They said, some days 9 camels, some days 10 camels. He looked at his companions and he said, then the army is between 900 and 1,000, as 1 camel feeds 100 men. The Prophet's technique in obtaining information during war was far removed from any violence or dehumanization of prisoners of war.
Muslims are not allowed to torture prisoners of war physically or even psychologically. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, blamed one of his companions for walking some prisoners of war along a path where they saw their dead before the burial. He said, "O Bilal, don't you have mercy in your heart?"
In fact, Islamic teachings go even further in encouraging good treatment for prisoners of war. The Quran describes it as an expression of love for God. The Quran says, "And out of love for Allah, they feed the poor, the orphan, and the prisoner of war."
ويطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا.
In 630 AD, the Prophet Muhammad led an army of 10,000 Muslims. Till that day, it was the biggest army ever to march in Arabia. They marched towards Mecca, which was to surrender to him peacefully, without a single blow of conflict.
For more than 20 years, the people of Mecca caused nothing but hardship for the Prophet. They persecuted him and his followers while they were in Mecca. And they waged wars against them after their migration to Medina.
People usually accept, peace treaties when they're unable to sway a battle in their favor. The Prophet, peace be upon him, when he comes into Mecca, he comes in now as the dominator, as the guy in charge, if he wants to be. But how does he come in? With humility, with tranquility, with forgiveness, with an open heart. It's almost unbelievable to see someone that could act in this fashion towards people who killed his uncles, who persecuted him, who embargoed him, who treated him with such evil actions, that he comes back and says what? To these prisoners of war, he says, whoever wants to be safe, let them go to the house of Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan was the greatest enemy of the Prophet. So this is a historical moment which Muslims have to reflect on from that time to the end of time on how Muslims should treat their adversaries in war.
The Meccans gathered and the Prophet mercifully asked them, "What do you think I will do with you?" With fear in their hearts and tears in their eyes, they said, "You are a noble brother and a noble nephew."
Prophet Muhammad announced a universal pardon. He said, "No reproach upon you this day. May Allah forgive you." And their lives were spared, and their homes and properties remained in their possession.
500 years later, Salah al-Din, a Muslim leader, would follow in the footsteps of Prophet Muhammad in dealing with prisoners of war after defeating his enemies in one of the bloodiest battles of all time. Some people claim that the goal behind jihad is something far more sinister than fighting against oppression.
Islam is an anti-Christ religion that intends through violence to conquer the world.
Jihad was, for 1,300 years, a holy war led by the Caliphate, the World Islamic State.
Islam is a one-party totalitarian system. It's a one-party state that will not allow you to speak, and it will kill anybody who challenges or questions.
Islam is not a religion. Islam is a very dangerous political ideology.
To our society, and it's time we wake up. This is not just a nice religion. It is a political movement bent on world domination through the sword. That's what jihad is.
We have a problem all over the world with the ideology of hatred, which is called Islam.
Jihad is not holy war, and that's a common confusion that's found in a lot of dictionaries and even some translations of Quran, that the word jihad is translated as holy war. Actually, war is not holy, life is holy. And the reason that war is legislated in Islam is to protect life in the first place. All of that goes back to protecting the sanctity of life. And within war itself, there are so many rules and regulations that the Muslim has to follow, which are designed to protect the innocent from harm or even abuse.
Unfortunately, some people claim that combative jihad is a holy war against non-Muslims or a war to spread Islam all over the world. And to prove their point, they go as far as using some verses from the Quran, manipulating them and taking them out of context, taking advantage of the lack of knowledge of their audience about the Quran.
The expression holy war was introduced to the world in the literature of the Crusaders about 900 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. Pope Urban II was the first pope to spread the idea of holy war, or a crusade, to the European public as a term for the recapture of Holy Land from the Muslims. He urged his bishops to preach to their communities. Taking advantage of the Europeans' passion for religion, the symbol chosen for the Crusades consisted of 5 crosses, symbolizing the 5 wounds that they believed Jesus Christ received during the Passion. The Pope and his legislators promised forgiveness and eternal happiness to the impoverished and famine-stricken Christian peasants if they would die in the Crusades for Christ. The Pope's famous words were, "God himself will lead you, for you will be doing his work. Deus vult," which means God wills it. The response to his speech was far greater than even he expected. History was firmly marked when hundreds of thousands marched towards the east, predominantly from France, Germany, and Italy.
European historians never had any consensus on the exact number of crusaders in the First Crusade, but Muslim historians claim that there were over 1 million men from different European countries.
Some crusaders were motivated by their Christian piety and the will to liberate the city of God, while others were driven by greed and the will to establish new faith strongholds in the wealthy East. What no one can deny is the looting, plundering, abuse, and pillaging that took place at every opportunity. The undisciplined rabble marched eastwards, massacring Jews in the Rhineland, and even attacking and pillaging the Christian villagers of Hungary and Bulgaria.
After the fall of Jerusalem in the hands of the Crusaders of the First Crusade, all 70,000 Muslim civilians of Jerusalem were killed and slaughtered. Men, women, and children. Historians mention that their blood flowed like rivers in the streets of Jerusalem.
Historically, Saladin or Salahuddin, the Muslim commander who defeated the Crusaders, did not kill any civilians after his victorious entry into Jerusalem. His magnanimity stands out, in contrast to what the Crusaders did nearly 90 years earlier, killing nearly 70,000 civilians.
Therefore, we see that to never target non-combatants and never torture prisoners of war are 2 main rules of combat in Islam. However, the Islamic code of combat is far more extensive than these 2 rules.
The code of combat in Islam is comprehensive and covers many social, economic, as well